In this video, we are going to accomplish two things. First up, we're going to learn how to watch for changes to the store. So currently we have calls to things like store.getState, but these don't rerun as the store changes. We need to be able to do that in order to do things like re-render our application. So that's thing one. The other thing you're going to learn about is how you can dispatch an action and actually pass some data along as well. That's going to allow us to do more than just pass the action type. So let's kick things off by talking about how we can actually watch for changes to the Redux store state. To get that done, Redux actually gives us store.subscribe. Store.subscribe gets called, it's a function, and we pass a single function to it. And this function gets called every single time the store changes. For the moment, we're just going to log the object to the screen, which means I'm going to take the console.log call from below, cut it out, and paste it right in here. This is going to have the effect of printing the state every single time it changes. I'm going to go ahead and remove some of the leftover comments, and I'm also going to remove the store.getState call down below. And now what we should see are 4 logs printing, because after we register it, we have 4 changes to the state. I'm going to go ahead and save Redux 101 over inside of the browser. The application is refreshing, and right here we can see the changes to the Redux store over time. We go from 0 to 1, from 1 to 2, we reset it back to 0, and we decrement it to -1. So using store.subscribe is a fantastic way to do something when the state changes. Not only can we subscribe to the store, we can also remove our individual subscription. So let's say we want to stop subscribing at some point. How do we do that? Well, the return value from subscribe is actually a function we can call to unsubscribe. So right here, I would name that if I want to actually unsubscribe a const. We can call it anything we like. I'm going to call it unsubscribe. We then set it equal to the return value from subscribe, and then we call this whenever we are done. So I'm going to call it right here after the first dispatch. Unsubscribe. It doesn't take any arguments, you just have to call it, and when we call it, this subscription will stop, which means that we are going to see our log printed one time for this dispatch. We're not going to see it the other 3 times, because by the time these guys run, we've already unsubscribed from the changes. Right here, we get exactly that. We just have one printing because we start right here, we unsubscribe, and everything else gets ignored. The state is still changing, we're just not being notified via this subscription. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the call to unsubscribe, and once again, we're going to see the log print 4 times over inside of the console, and there we have it. This is how we can subscribe to data and do something meaningful when it changes. Now I want to go ahead and talk about how we can dispatch dynamic actions. Currently, all of our actions just have the type property. This makes them valid, but it doesn't allow us to pass extra information along, dynamic information from, say, user input. Now, type has to be provided. If I get rid of type or just change the name to something else, like type with 2 E's, Redux is actually going to throw an error. Over here inside of the console, uncaught error, actions may not have an undefined type property. So we have to provide type. If you don't provide type, Redux is going to crash, but you can toss as many additional things on here as you want. So for example, on increment, I could say I want to increment by some value. I'm going to go with 5. So instead of increasing the count by 1, I would increase it by 5. And I could set things up to use increment by here and then leave it off here, in which case I would just default to 1. So how exactly do we set this up? First up, what we need to do is use increment by, which is now available to us on the action object. So not only do we have action.type, we also have action.increment by. But remember, we might not always have it, so we're going to use a little bit of conditional logic to figure out exactly what we should increase the count by. To get this done right here, we can go ahead and just define a new variable. I'm going to make a const called increment by, and we're going to set it equal to, and then we're going to use the ternary operator to determine whether we should use the value passed in or if we should just default to 1. So in order to get that done, we have to check the type of action.increment by. If it is equal to a number, then we're going to go ahead and actually use that as the value for increment by. Right here, after the question mark, we can add the value for when this condition is true. That is going to be action.increment by. Now, if it's not true, we're just going to default the value to 1. That'll be the default incrementer. And now we can actually use increment by down below instead of 1, increment by. This is going to allow us to increment by 1 by default or some value if it's provided. We can now go ahead and actually save Redux 101, and we can see that right away the count goes to 5, which is correct since we provided increment by of 5. We then go up to 6. We did not provide any value for increment by, so we default to 1, and we are indeed seeing that. We then reset to 0, and we subtract 1 to get back to -1. So there we have it. We're able to pass dynamic information along inside of our action objects. The store can then use that information to calculate the new state. Now it's your turn to do the exact same thing for decrement. So you're going to set up decrement to take a decrement by value. So if I want to decrement by 10, I would provide decrement by, and I would set it equal to 10. And then that would actually change the calculation up above. So instead of using -1, I would use -10. Now, once again, you're going to want to figure out if the value was provided at all. If it was, you're going to use it. If it was not, you're going to go ahead and use the default instead. Now, to test your work, what you can do is just duplicate this, decrementing twice. Have one of them use the default, in which case it should reduce the count by 1. Have another one actually provide decrement by and make sure it decreases by the correct amount. Take as much time as you need to knock this one out and then test your work. When you're done, go ahead and click play. All right, let's go ahead and knock this one out. Step 1 for me is going to be to actually use decrement by somewhere down below. I'm going to go ahead and use it on this second guy. Decrement by. I'm going to decrement by 10, exactly like what we had below. So I would expect the count to go from 0 to -1 here, and then from -1 to -11 because of this guy. So now I can actually add support for this. Currently, we're not going to get an error, but it's not going to be using that value. So we see we get -2 instead of -11. Up above, though, we can go ahead and fix that right here. I'll make a const. I'm going to call this one decrement by. And once again, we're going to set it equal to something dynamic. The condition is whether the type of action.decrement by is a number. If it is equal to a number, great. We're going to go ahead and use the value action.decrement by. If it's not a number, that's fine too. We're just going to default the value equal to 1. Now all we need to do is actually use this variable down below. Instead of the static one, we are going to access the value of the variable we just defined. And now if we go ahead and save Redux 101 over in the browser, we can see we go from 0 to -1, which means the default case still works. And we're going from -1 to -11, which means that when we provide decrement by, the store is getting mutated correctly. And this is fantastic. We now have a way to dispatch generic actions like reset and dynamic actions like increment and decrement. Now, aside from taking in no extra values or some optional ones, we can also just create actions that have required types by just using them directly as opposed to checking if they exist. So we might have something like store.dispatch. We might dispatch an action with the type equal to. In this case, we would call it set, and this would let us set the count, and we might require the count you want to set. And let's say we want to set it equal to 101. So this is perfectly valid. All we're going to do is use count over inside of the function up above, just like we did for decrement by and increment by, but we're not going to check if it exists because it's not optional. We're going to force those who use set to actually provide the value 101. Now to get that done, all we need to do up above is to actually set up a case for it. I'm going to put that right here. Case set. When someone calls set, we return an object where count equals the value of action.count. And there we have it. We now have set in place. And if we actually save Redux 101, we can see at the very bottom, our action does correctly set the count equal to 101. Now that we have this in place, we know all about how to dispatch dynamic actions, and we're going to continue looking at more Redux features in the next video. So stay tuned. I'll see you then.